Today's learning is once again going to be in the merit of all the Jewish people in a difficult situation, all the soldiers on the front lines that are fighting for the Jewish people, all of the Jews taken hostage, and a complete victory for the Jewish people against any and all enemies from the outside and including also from the inside as well, psychological, mental enemies, emotional enemies, and so on and so forth. So without any further ado, we're going to start. So we spoke last chapter how God is beyond our understanding, and the only way to understand him is through his coming down into the Torah and the mitzvahs that we have, which are the 613 mitzvot. It's the only way that we can really touch God, so to speak. And now we're going to go into that process and analyze it a little bit further. פרק ה' ולתוספת ביור באר היטב והשום תפיסה שאמר אליהו לעת מחשב תפיסה בחולו, which we said to explain now this idea of grasping, of understanding, which no one can grasp God besides through the Torah and mitzvah, like we said. What happens in the process of a thought? He explains like this. הרי השכל תופס את המושכל ומקיפו בשכלו, והמושכל נתפס ומוקף ומלובש בתוך השכל שהשיגו והשכילו, וגם השכל מלובש במושכל בשעה שמשיגו ותופסו בשכלו. So there's a twofold system, there's a twofold thing that's going on at the moment of a thought. Number one is the concept is inside of the mind. The mind is like a box that's holding a concept inside of it. And it's encompassing the thought. The mind covers over and has inside of it a thought. And on the other hand, the mind is actually within the thought. As we explained that what happens at the time of a thought is the mind is expressing itself in a certain idea. And when something expresses itself in something else, that means it becomes completely covered over by that other thing. It becomes completely encompassed by the other thing. So there's a twofold thing happening over here. On the one hand, the thought is inside of the mind, and on the other hand, the mind is inside of the thought. What happens, for example, when someone understands clearly and thoroughly a certain halacha, a certain law in the Torah, like for example in the Mishnah or in the Gemara? So what happens is, like we said, two things. Number one, the actual law, the Torah, comes inside of the person's mind. And on the other hand as well, the mind comes inside of the Torah. At that time of the thought. Now this law of the Torah is God's will and wisdom. That God's desire is that when, let's call him, for example, Reuven, claims so-and-so, and then Shimon claims so-and-so, then the outcome should be so-and-so. God's will is that in this theoretical situation, that so-and-so claims one thing and the other claims the other thing, God's will is for the end result to be so-and-so. For example, ואף אם לא היה ולא יהיה הדבר הזה לעודם לבוא למשפט על טענות ותביעות אלו מכל מקום אחר שככה ברצונו וחוכמתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא שאם יותן זה כך וזה כך יהיה פסק כך So now, even if it won't actually come about, the laws of the Torah are not things that actually happened in real life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a story that took place or something that will happen in the future. It could be something that never happens ever in history. But nevertheless, in the theoretical situation where such a thing and such a thing is going to happen, where this person is going to claim this and that person is going to claim that. In a theoretical situation, God's will would be that this should be the outcome. So, כשהאדם יודע ומשיג בשכלו פסק זה כהלכה ארוכה במשנה וגמרא ופוסקים, אחרי זה משיג ותופס ומקיף בשכלו לרצונו וחוכמתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא דרך מחשבת תפיסה בי, ולא ברצונו וחוכמתו כי אם התרפשותם בהלכות ארוכות לפנינו. So what happens is that person has in his mind a certain idea from the Torah, from the Mishnah, from the Gemara, from the commentaries. He has in his mind the will and wisdom of Hashem, of God, which no one can understand, because no one can understand God, like we said in chapter 4, unless it comes besides for God's will and wisdom, which is one with him, that comes into the Torah. And that's the only way that he can actually have in his mind and contain God's will and wisdom. In other words, contain, so to speak, God himself inside of his mind. And what's also happening, there's a second thing that's happening at that time. Not only is God's will and wisdom contained in his mind, but also, his mind is inside of God's will and wisdom. Like we said in the beginning, because when someone thinks a thought, that thought is his mind is expressed in the thought. In other words, his mind comes into the form of that thought. So, number one, God's will and wisdom is inside of the person's mind. And number two, the person's mind is inside of God's will and wisdom. So it's a complete unity. It's a unification of the person's mind and God's will and wisdom. והוא ייחוד נפלא שאין ייחוד כמוהו ולא כאחד נמצא כלל בגשמיות להיות לאחד במיוחד ממש מכל צד ופינה. This is a unity of two things that come together and become one. It's an awesome, incredible unity that doesn't exist in the physical world. Because in the physical world, things are limited to being themselves. And they don't actually form into one entity. They ultimately, even if it's on a small measure, are two separate things. But when it comes to the intellectual, then there is the unification of two things, the mind and the thought that the mind is thinking. They become unified, they become one. In a form that they're completely one from any side and any place, you have a unification of these things. There isn't a place in the mind where you won't find the thought, and there isn't a place in the thought where you won't find the mind. It's a complete one and unison. And וזאת מעלה יותר גדולה ונפלאה לאין קץ, אשר במצוות ידיעת התורה והשגתה על כל המצוות מעשיות. ואפילו על מצוות התלויות בדיבור, ואפילו על מצוות תלמוד אשר בדיבור. This is the advantage of the understanding of the Torah versus all the physical mitzvot, which even the mitzvot that comes in the mouth, even the mitzvah of speaking Torah, even though it's a very lofty mitzvah, it doesn't have this advantage that there is in the knowledge of the Torah. As we explained before, what's the advantage of the mitzvot? That we explained in the beginning of chapter 4, that they become the physical limbs. Let's say, for example, when it comes to speaking, the mouth or the arms and the legs, whatever is involved, whatever physical part of the body is involved in doing the mitzvah, becomes a chariot, so to speak, becomes, so to speak, a channel for God's will. And when it comes to learning Torah in the mind, not only is the mind a chariot for God's will, but it's not even a mind anymore. It's actually become one with God's will. It is God's will, so to speak. It's unified with God's will. The mitzvot, you have the physical parts of the body, and these physical things happen to be capable of becoming a vehicle for God. But it's still something separate. It's not completely one. It's two separate things. There's the physical body, and there's God's will, and they're working in sync. But over here, there isn't two separate things: your mind, and God's will. Instead, they become one. They become one entity, and that's the advantage of learning Torah with the mind, with understanding. Ki, as he explains, Al Yidei Kol HaMitzvot Shebedibuch U'Ma'aseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Malbish Et Nefesh Makifa Or Hashem Erosha V'Ad Ragla. Through doing physical mitzvot with the speech or with the physical parts of the body, Hashem's light is encompassing and garbs and shines around the body from the head to toe. But when it comes to understanding the Torah, מלבד שהשכל מלובש בחוכמת השם, הנה גם חוכמת השם בקרבו. מה שהשכל משיג ותופס ומקיף בשכל, ומה שאפשר לו לתפוס ולהשיג מידיעת התורה איש כפי שכל וכוח ידיעתו והשגתו בפרדס. Not only, when it comes to understanding the Torah, not only is the Torah encompassed by God's will and wisdom, but on vice versa, also God's will and wisdom is encompassed by the mind. The mind has inside of it, is containing inside of it God's will and wisdom, and unification of the mind and God's will and wisdom. And it doesn't matter whether it's a complex and deep section of the Torah that's very intellectual, or something very simple like a story of the Torah, and so on and so forth. Whatever a person understands on any level of the 4 levels of the Torah, through that they are understanding God's will and wisdom, which means that their mind is becoming unified, literally, with God's will and wisdom. ולפי שבידיעת התורה מלובשת בנפש האדם ושכלו ומקפת בתוכם. Now, being that this is the case, that the Torah is inside of the mind when their mind is thinking it. Therefore, the Torah is referred to as the bread and the sustenance of the soul. Just as bread, physical bread, it gives sustenance to the body. When a person eats the bread, and the bread digests and turns into blood to become part of their flesh, become part of their body, and give their body sustenance. It comes into and becomes one with the body. It goes from a state of the bread being something outside of the body, and then actually coming down into and digesting and becoming part of the body. And through that, then the person will be able to be alive and well, and the person's body will be able to be well through the bread, through the eating and the transformation of the bread to becoming part of his body. So too, the example comes now for the Torah. עד שנתפסת בשכלו ומתאחדת עמו ויודע חדים נעשה מזון לנפש וחיים בקרבה מחיה חיים אין סוף ברוך הוא המלובש בחוכמתו ותורתו שבקרבה. When someone understands the Torah in themselves, in their intellect, in their mind, when it comes to thinking and having it processed in the mind, and it turns from something that's outside of them, a foreign idea, and becomes, so to speak, digested and processed within the person's mind, and they become unified just like sustenance for the soul, like bread, and it becomes life, and not just life for the soul, but life from God himself, because the Torah is one with God himself, the source of life, which is enclosed in the Torah, that is inside of the person. So learning Torah gives you life, gives your soul life, just like bread does. As it says that the Torah is inside of my inner parts. In the verse, as the book Eitz Chaim explains, shelevushi hanashamot began Eden hen hamitzvot, v'hatorah hi hamazon hanashamot she'asku be'olam hazeh b'torah lishma. That in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, in heaven, so to speak, what people might refer to as heaven, the garments of the soul. How does the soul express itself? It expresses itself through the mitzvot that it accomplished while it was in this world. That's the, so to speak, the garment that it's enclothed in. Obviously, in heaven, things are spiritual. It doesn't have a shirt and pants. It doesn't have physical garments. Instead, the garments over there are the mitzvot, are something that's, like we're saying, encompassing the soul. That's the idea of mitzvot. Whereas, it explains in Eitz Chaim, this book, this Kabbalistic book written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, whereas the Torah is actually something that comes into the soul. It's not only something that garbs the soul, but it's also like sustenance, like bread, that comes into the soul. And that to those people that learn the Torah for its own sake. So what is for its own sake? It explains in the Zohar. Or as it says in the Pri-Eitz Chaim, that the Shema, to learn Torah for its sake, what does it mean that you're learning Torah for its sake? That means that you're learning it in order to connect to God. You're using the Torah, so to speak, as a way to connect the soul to God. And for a person doing that, then the soul in heaven has the sustenance of the Torah also over there, as we explained. V'hamazon hi bechinat och pnimi, v'halavushim bechinat makifin. So, and in spiritual terms, sustenance is something that is limited, so to speak, and that is able to actually be held onto. You're able to actually, it comes into you. It's something that comes inside of you. Whereas garments are not something that comes inside of a person. Garments are encompassing the person. They don't come inside of the person. They're on the outside. So again, that's spiritually to understand. In heaven, the Torah comes inside, and the mitzvot encompass. ולכן אמרו חז"ל שתלמוד תורה שקול כנגד כל המצוות. Therefore, the sages say that the sages of blessed memory say that the Torah is equal to all of the mitzvot. Learning Torah is equivalent to doing all of the mitzvot. Why? The fisha hamitzvot and the vushim levand. V'hatorah hi mazon. Because the mitzvot are the only garments. They don't actually come into the soul. They encompass the soul, but they don't come into the soul. Whereas the Torah actually comes in and becomes one with the person, with the soul. And not only does it come into the soul, but it also is encompassing the soul. The soul comes into the Torah, and the Torah comes into the soul, and they become one. When a person learns and ponders the Torah, v'kol shekain k'shemotze b'piv b'dibuch she'ever dibuch nasa b'chinat och makif k'mo shekatu b'Pri-Eitz Chaim, and that's just by the knowledge, the understanding of the Torah, that it encompasses the soul. But for sure also, when a person uses their mouth to speak the Torah, then it also encompasses the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next video.